Hey, so I have some more exam advice for you in this video, and here we're going to look at how to evaluate theories and models in psychology. So hopefully in this video you're going to know how to write an excellent essay that evaluates a psychological theory or model. So in your IB psychology exams, if this question comes up, you'll know exactly what to do in a pretty straightforward manner. And I'm going to use an example of social cognitive theory, so if this is on your syllabus, then you'll know how to evaluate this theory as well. I've posted another video using this acronym D.E.A.L, and I think it works in this example as well, but just with slightly different meanings to the words. So if you're evaluating a theory or model, I think when you're planning out your essay, focus on the structure. Describe the theory. What is it? Where's the evidence? What are the applications? What are the limitations? D.E.A.L. To me, this is a really simple, straightforward way to show your knowledge and understanding of the research, and I think you're going to score top marks if you can do those four things really well. So let's look at point one, describe. So how do you describe the theory of the model? First of all, what is it attempting to explain? Then how is it trying to explain that thing, and also include the key terms and concepts. So you want to use the specific terminology in your description. So let's check out an example of social cognitive theory. What's this trying to explain? Basically behavior, really quite generally, although in the beginning it was used to explain aggression. And how does it explain behavior? It's saying the original social learning theory outlined two ways we learn. One is from direct experience, but Bandura, who proposed the theory, also said that we don't learn everything from direct experience, right? We can't afford to learn the fact that shooting ourselves in the foot with a gun is going to be painful. So we also learn things from our environment. For example, we learn from the observation of others. And so, and then in social cognitive theory, he added the idea of triadic reciprocal determinism, which is saying that behavior is the combination of factors: environment, the way we think, our biology, our personalities, our culture. All these things interact to produce behavior. And so, I mean, two of the key concepts is observational learning, and then the addition later of triadic reciprocal determinism. So a good description of social cognitive theory would include all of these things. Then, after we have the description of the theory or the model, we get into the evidence. So how are the claims of the research of the theory of the model demonstrated in specific studies, right? And so in IB psychology, you want to be aiming, I think, for two. You want to really use two studies to support that in your essay. So if we're looking at social cognitive theory, observational learning, I think I wouldn't go past Bandura's Bobo doll studies. He had different types, different examples and modifications of the study, but I think one of those is going to be useful, and these show that children learn aggression through observation. That would be one study you could use. And then to show triadic reciprocal determinism, this is pretty hard because not many studies show more than one factor interacting with behavior. I should say the majority of studies show one variable affecting behavior, but a good one to do, I think, is to look at any epigenetic study. So where you're looking, the research is looking at a combination of genetics and the environment to explain behavior. And a good one there, especially if you're doing a criminology unit, would be D.E.A.L's study, where they found it wasn't just the presence of the warrior MAOAL, right, the low expression variant of that gene. It wasn't just having that gene that produced antisocial behavior like, bullying, criminal behavior, violence, aggression, those kinds of antisocial behaviors. But it was the combination of experiencing childhood abuse and having the MAOAL gene, all right, the low expression variant of that gene. Having those two things combined would increase the likelihood of antisocial behavior. So I think that's a good one to use to show triadic reciprocal determinism. Right, applications. So we've got the description of the theory, then we've got our evidence. Now we're looking at applications. How has that theory been used? How has it been applied in a practical sense? So if we go back to social cognitive theory, one of the ways that they've applied the concept of observational learning is something called the Sabido method. And the idea that if people can learn through observation, they can learn negative behaviors, but maybe we can actually also use observation to teach pro-social behaviors. So if you grew up watching Sesame Street, you might remember, some of the episodes are about, sharing and being kind, and, they're a little bit over the top, but I mean, they're for kids, right? So these types of TV shows are trying to show kids how to behave in a nice way. So that's one of the applications of social cognitive theory, and it's really, it's been used in education as well. And so if we think, okay, if we learn by modeling and observation, then we can also use that in different teaching techniques, and specifically in programs targeted to reduce youth violence. There's been examples where kids are trained in a variety of different methods to try and learn, how to cope with anger and aggression, and how to reduce violent behavior. But if you're doing social cognitive theory, just do a quick Google Scholar search, social cognitive theory applications, and it's been used in so many different fields, from designing web pages and into online learning platforms, and oh man, there was another one that just escaped my mind, but it's been used a lot. So applications of the theory, that's what you want to look for when you're evaluating a theory. And finally we get to limitations, right? So we've got the evidence and the applications of the strengths. Now we go, but hang on, are there limitations? And one of the things you can look for are there alternative explanations. So for example, if you're looking at a social theory of psychology, like social identity theory or social cognitive theory, you say, well, what about other fields of psychology, like biological psychology? Are there factors here that we might be missing in this explanation? Is there contradictory evidence? So you've looked at the evidence that supports the theory, but is there something that actually that contradicts? Is there a study that goes against the theory? And then I would just put a general category for other. There are lots of other ways you can evaluate it, but I think they're the two key ones. And I'll just make a point on evaluating the supporting evidence. So a lot of students in their IB psychology exams will evaluate, they'll say, one limitation of social cognitive theory is that the Bobo studies lack ecological validity. Technically, you could argue it's a limitation of the theory, but I think it's really down the list of the things you want to show. I think evaluating the study is not a great way to evaluate the theory. I just think do it if you're really stuck. If you've got nothing else to write about and you want to show some critical thinking, I would say okay, but ideally you're going to have prepared and you're going to know how to evaluate the theory in other ways besides evaluating the supporting evidence. Now I just want to remind you about critical thinking, right? So you're trying to evaluate theories. This is hard and it takes a lot of time. So don't think it's easy, but the other thing I want to point out as well is that critical thinking, I think, should be independent. It should be your thinking. Alrighty, so if we just get real for a second about evaluating theories and models, and for a high school IB psychology class, you do want to come up with your own critiques, your critical thinking. As a teacher, I don't tell my students strengths and limitations of theories and studies. I try and teach them how to come up with their own evaluation. In my textbook and my resources, I never summarize in bullet point strengths and limitations of things, because remembering someone else's evaluation is memory, it's knowledge, it's not critical thinking, it's not deep thinking. So so you really want to be showing your thinking. But with that being said, in the curriculum you're studying these theories because they're really good theories and they have a lot of supporting evidence and they're not very easy to evaluate. If they were really weak and flawed and easy to critique, they wouldn't be in the curriculum. So we have to remember that. And I guess this point is as much for examiners and teachers as it is for students, that we want you to independently evaluate these theories that have really stood up to the test of time, hence they're in our curriculum. It'd be kind of, asking a high school student to evaluate Shakespeare's use of dramatic irony. We don't ask kids to do that because Shakespeare was pretty good at using dramatic irony. So we're not really expecting a first-year drama student or a first-year IB psychology student to come up with these limitations that maybe no one else has thought of before. So this is why I think having alternative explanations and alternative evidence is enough, right, for you to show your critical thinking skills. You're probably not going to be able to come up with a limitation in these theories that have been around for 10, 20, 30, 50 years, some of them. Now, coming back to social cognitive theory, limitations of this, right? So social cognitive theory, if we're saying that originally it was used, or social learning theory, which became social cognitive theory, was used to explain aggression, what I would like to see in my students is that they can actually have alternative explanations for this, that they know that we can't just look at the social side of things, we can't just look at that as observation. They might also say, well, hey, it's biology, right? Hormones, brain activity, these things could be factors in behavior. And it could be cultural factors. If you grow up in a culture of honor, this may increase the chances of observing people who are violent and learning it for yourself. And so as a teacher here, this is why I'm looking for this, is because I want my students to know that behavior is not just explained from one angle. It's not just explained from social factors, right? Biology and cognition and culture play a part as well. And Bandura kind of has that covered when he added the triadic reciprocal determinism. Really hard to evaluate that because he's saying it is biology, it's culture, it's cognition. We can't ignore those things. So I mean, but I think that's fine to point out that he did kind of cover his ass by saying, look, it's all these factors. It's not just social factors. But then that brings me to the next limitation, which again I'm kind of giving you the answer here because I wouldn't expect my students to be able to come up with this for a reason I'll explain in a second. But triadic reciprocal determinism, isn't this just stating the obvious? The idea came out, I mean, he came out with social cognitive theory, he revamped it in the 1980s. Now, in the 1980s, what's that? We're looking at, 30 to 40 years ago. This idea could have been insightful. Hey, that all these factors interact, it's not just one. But now, we've studied this for so long, and there's so much research in epigenetics and, interactions between cognition, behavior, the brain, hormones. It's just kind of common knowledge. So, I do wonder, how valuable is social cognitive theory now? Or, sorry, how valuable is the concept of triadic reciprocal determinism, since it's such a well-known fact? Now, this is where I'm saying, critical thinking is all about knowledge, right? Critical thinking is based in knowledge. You can't think critically about a subject you know nothing about, which is why if I come back to, this point here about triadic reciprocal determinism, this would be very hard for students to come up by themselves because, it requires understanding a lot of psychological research that happened in the last 40 years, which I only know because I've been studying this for a decade. Students who have been studying this course for 6 months, 18 months, I wouldn't necessarily expect them to be able to make that point. Anyway, critical thinking, it's all about knowledge. So if we come back to just reviewing our structure, if you're asked to evaluate a theory or model, describe it. Where's the evidence? What are the applications? And what are the limitations? So if you're asked to evaluate in your IB psychology exam, right? Evaluate means make an appraisal by weighing up strengths, limitations. You can see the D.E.A.L structure does exactly that. If you can have really excellent points for each of those 4 parts of your essay, you're going to do great. A lot of people argue that discuss and evaluate mean different things. I don't think they do. Discuss, a considered and balanced review. So if you're giving a balanced review of a theory or a model, well, first of all you say, well, here's the theory / model, whatever it is. The evidence and applications is the strengths, but you need to balance that by going, but hang on, here are the limitations. So this is why evaluate and discuss mean the same thing. The strengths and limitations balance each other out. It gives it a balanced review, right? So if you have a D.E.A.L structure, you're going to do well. And if we look at the rubric, this is for the new IB psychology course. So the knowledge and understanding part, this is your description, right? The question is asking you about a theory or a model. If you have a really good description, it's going to show that you understand the model, and if you're using the appropriate terminology. Then your evidence, the supporting evidence, the E in our D.E.A.L structure, the use of research to support the answer. You're saying here's the theory, and here's the strengths, here's the evidence that supports that theory. And then our critical thinking. Now the limitations of the theory I think would definitely fall under critical thinking. I would also, in my own marking of this, I would put in applications under critical thinking, but other examiners, other teachers might put applications under the knowledge and understanding. I think we won't know really what the IB is expecting there until they release their first mark schemes, but I would include this under here. And so we can see just by using this rubric that our D.E.A.L structure is going to provide you with everything you need to do really well. Now, what if the question is contrast? If you're asked to contrast 2 theories, and I think the only time this would be asked in the new IB psychology curriculum if you're asked to contrast 2 models of memory, in which case I would contrast multi-store model and the working memory model. I don't think there's anything to worry about here. Just I would drop off the limitations, because to show your critical thinking you're going to be contrasting, not evaluating. So you just leave the limitations out. So you would start by here's the description of the first model or theory. Here's the evidence, and if you want applications, you might not need to include that though. And then I'd go, but there's also our second one, describe, evidence, application, and now you've given the context by having both. Then you get into similarities and differences. This is where your contrast is happening. You can say, well, this one does this, but actually this one does this, right? And so that's where you would show your critical thinking in these similarities and differences. So I still think the D.E.A.L structure is valuable, but you just change the L with the contrast. So D.E.A.C maybe. Right, I hope that was helpful. If you need more help, if you're after more answers, subscribe to our blog. I'll put links in the comments where you can find that. Join our Facebook group, post a question there, or head to our store and see what resources we've got that might be useful for you. So yeah, again, I hope that was helpful. Cheers.